conception.
Oh God, no. Andrew's earlier attempts had all resulted in him spilling on her as he'd held her down before he was able to complete his assault. She'd paled for his failings on those days. Then she'd paid again when, with the arrival of her monthly course, she'd been pressed to announce that she had not been with child. How could she possibly have been? He must have known that much. Or perhaps in his madness, he didn't want to remember he had failed. Nell shut down the memory of the only real coupling, rough, short, and painful, weeks ago. It was his one successful attempt in a scant 3 months of marriage. But any possibility of conception had again been dashed when last week her course had come early. She'd hidden it from him, not wanting to endure.
I should have left you to fend for yourself in the camps at Ballarat, but you submitted to your duty.
Never willingly. He'd assumed that she had conceived because he'd managed to penetrate. Believing he would cease the beatings, she hadn't corrected him. He'd blared to his sister that he would soon have an heir. He was still shouting.
Otherwise cast you off as useless, sent you back to your lying cur of a father. A good thing my sister is now informed of the forthcoming issue. She will see to you in your confinement.
Nell couldn't remember if she'd heard Enid's whining voice during the altercation last night. But if Enid was to see to her in her confinement, why were they bolting away from their home now?
She agrees with me, however,
he continued loudly, bouncing about the seat they shared, his hip squashing hers.
You're just like your predecessor. A weak baggage.
His first wife, Susan, poor girl. She was blessedly free of him, and of this earth. She hadn't been able to endure his beatings, and both she and the babe had died in premature childbirth. Had Susan's father betrayed her too, like Nell's father had betrayed her? He'd taken her by the arm in a punishing grip to Susan's funeral. There, they'd witnessed the dead woman's only relative, a brother, just back from some war in Europe, shaking uncontrollably, distraught with grief. And afterwards, finally threatened with abandonment by her father. Nell's hand had been forced. She'd grudgingly consented, accepted her fate, and mere weeks after the funeral, Nell was married to Amberton. Too late, she'd learned from Andrew that he'd paid her father to entice him into handing her over like some prize sow. If there was any consolation in this humiliation, it was that Andrew would have despised paying. Her lip curled now. All this because her father, Alfred Thomas, had a new wife to support. Dora had firmly urged him to move along his hard-to-handle spinster daughter. Never mind that Nell worked the family laundry business alone. But perhaps her doing so reminded her father that he'd failed as a landowner, failed as a provider for his family, and the once comfortable life that afforded his daughter her education was now gone, thanks to his drinking and gambling. That his daughter's own manual labour had to support him prior to her marriage. The money Amberton paid for her must have given her father and his new wife reprieve from having to work the laundry themselves, and they'd closed it down. Typical of her father. It would be a short-lived financial reprieve. The recently wed Dora was a spending force to be reckoned with, a rival to his own. Andrew hadn't paid for Susan. He'd somehow, by thuggery or otherwise, acquired a loan from Susan's father instead. Nell had spied a paper to that effect, witnessed by Andrew's nephew, Lewis Wiltshire. The coach jolted. A grunt escaped her, turning her thoughts. I will not be beaten down. I will not have the same fate as Susan. I will do anything to survive. Nell's ire thrummed. Andrew Amberton's fists might well be intolerable, but she would not break under his aggression. She'd fought back at first, physically.